What if the quietest workers on Earth simply stopped showing up tomorrow? Imagine waking to a world where fruit trees stand heavy with blossoms that never become fruit. Almond orchards fail. Blueberries vanish from markets. Wildflowers that once fed songbirds and mammals produce no seeds. This is not science fiction. Roughly 3/4 of the world's flowering plants, and about 1/3 of global crop production by volume, rely on animal pollinators, primarily bees. If those pollinators disappeared, the calorie staples that keep us alive, wheat, rice, maize, would largely continue because they are wind-pollinated. But the nutritional quality of the human diet would collapse. Modeling studies show that total loss of animal pollination could cut global fruit supplies by around 23%, vegetables by 16%, and nuts and seeds by 22%, driving micronutrient deficiencies in vitamin A and folate for hundreds of millions of people, and contributing to an estimated 1.4 million additional deaths per year from related diseases. That single fact should stop the scroll. The species at the center of this story is not a dramatic predator or a charismatic mammal. It is the bee, especially the western honeybee and the thousands of wild bee species that move pollen from one flower to another. If you care about the hidden systems that actually keep civilization fed and ecosystems functioning, stay with this. Subscribe so you never miss the next deep look at the living architecture of our planet. Bees belong to the order Hymenoptera. There are more than 20,000 described species. The western honeybee, Apis mellifera, is the most familiar because humans have managed it for millennia, moving hives to orchards and fields. Wild bees, bumblebees, solitary bees, stingless bees, often perform equal or greater work in many landscapes. Scientists study them through direct observation of flower visits, pollen analysis, experimental exclusion cages, and long-term monitoring of colony health and wild populations. Their role is straightforward. While foraging for nectar and pollen, they transfer male gametes between flowers, enabling fertilization and seed or fruit production. Without that transfer, many plants cannot reproduce at scale. That transfer is the anchoring detail of this story. A single bee carrying a dusting of pollen on its body is the microscopic hinge between plant and animal kingdoms, between wild ecosystems and the human dinner table. We will return to that pollen grain 3 times. The hidden truth is that bees do far more than service crops. They sustain the base of terrestrial food webs. Flowering plants that depend on them produce the seeds, fruits, and foliage that feed herbivores, which in turn feed predators and scavengers. Remove the pollinators and plant communities shift toward wind-pollinated or self-pollinating species. Biodiversity contracts. Studies of pollinator decline already document reduced seed set in wild plants and cascading effects on insects, birds, and mammals that rely on those plants. Long-term ecological research and global assessments, including work synthesized by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, show that wild pollinator abundance and diversity are falling in many regions due to habitat loss, pesticides, climate change, pathogens, and intensive agriculture. Managed honeybee colonies have increased globally in recent decades because beekeepers actively rebuild them. Yet annual losses in some countries still reach 30 to 50%, requiring constant replacement. The system is strained. Ecosystems did not evolve with isolated organisms. Flowering plants and their pollinators co-evolved over more than 100 million years. Cretaceous fossils already show specialized bee-like insects and early flowers. That partnership shaped the diversity of angiosperms that dominate modern terrestrial landscapes. Historical examples of disruption, such as the loss of native pollinators on islands after human arrival, demonstrate how quickly plant reproduction can fail and how dependent secondary species become. What scientists project, if major pollinator groups vanished, is not the overnight extinction of humanity. That claim is unsupported and often traced to a misattributed quotation. The evidence-based consequences are still severe. Agricultural yields of pollinator-dependent crops would drop. Nutritional diversity would shrink. Micronutrient deficiencies would rise, particularly in regions already vulnerable. Food prices for fruits, vegetables, and nuts would climb. Farmers who rely on those crops would face economic losses measured in tens to hundreds of billions of dollars annually in global analyses. Wild ecosystems would simplify, with measurable losses in plant diversity and the animals that depend on them. If this level of interconnected evidence is valuable to you, like the video and share it with someone who still thinks nature is optional. It helps more people find these stories. Scientific debate exists. Not every crop is equally dependent. Some can partially self-pollinate or receive help from other insects, wind, or human hand pollination in extreme cases. Managed honeybees can be transported and replaced more readily than wild species. Some researchers emphasize that total agricultural production would fall by only a few percent in calorie terms because staples dominate. Others stress that the quality of the remaining diet, the resilience of ecosystems, and the economic and health burdens matter more than bulk calories. Ecological systems are complex. Predicting exact cascade speed and extent remains uncertain because of redundancy among pollinator species and the ability of some plants to shift strategies. What is not in serious dispute is that widespread sustained loss would degrade both natural systems and human well-being. Walk the chain reaction carefully, grounded in evidence. First, flowering plants that require animal pollination produce fewer seeds and fruits. Crop yields of almonds, blueberries, cherries, apples, cucumbers, melons, and many others decline sharply. Modeling indicates global fruit production could fall more than 20% under complete pollinator loss. Second, wild plant communities change. Species that cannot reproduce without bees become rarer. Plant diversity drops. The seeds, berries, and foliage that feed birds, small mammals, and insects diminish. Third, food webs tighten. Insectivorous birds and mammals lose prey or plant resources. Herbivores, dependent on specific flowering plants, decline. Predators higher in the chain feel the pressure. Biodiversity contracts further. Fourth, human nutrition suffers. Reduced supplies of fruits, vegetables, and nuts, lower intakes of vitamin A, folate, and other micronutrients. Epidemiological modeling links such losses to hundreds of thousands of additional annual deaths from non-communicable diseases and malnutrition-related conditions. Fifth, agriculture and economies adjust painfully. Farmers expand land for less nutritious but reliable staples, increasing pressure on remaining habitat. Hand pollination, already practiced for some high-value crops in parts of Asia, is labor-intensive and expensive at scale. Economic valuations of pollination services run into hundreds of billions of dollars globally each year. Sixth, climate interactions appear where supported. Healthy plant communities and soils, influenced by diverse vegetation, help regulate local water cycles and carbon storage. Simplified systems can reduce that buffering capacity, though the magnitude is still under study. One unexpected human response illustrates the reverse. In parts of China, declining wild pollinators led farmers in some apple and pear orchards to hand-pollinate flowers with brushes. It works for limited areas at high cost, but it also demonstrates human willingness to invest enormous labor once the natural service is recognized as missing. Conservation efforts elsewhere, restoring wildflower strips, reducing pesticide exposure, protecting nesting habitat, and breeding more resilient bee stocks, have stabilized or increased local populations in targeted landscapes. These successes show that the relationship can be repaired when people act on the evidence. What scientists have learned is that no species exists in isolation. Bees illustrate the principle that complex life on Earth is held together by countless reciprocal services, many of them invisible until they falter. The pollen grain carried on a bee's body is not a minor detail. It is the physical link that turns solar energy captured by plants into the food webs that ultimately support us. Biodiversity is not a luxury. It is the operating system of the biosphere that made human civilization possible. The question that remains is not whether we can survive without every single bee species. The deeper question is how much of the living architecture we are willing to dismantle before the systems that feed, clothe, and stabilize us begin to fail in ways we can no longer easily repair. What responsibility do we carry for the quiet partnerships that still hold the planet together? If this documentary-style exploration of the real science moved you, subscribe for more rigorously researched stories about the species and systems that shape our future. Comment below with the one fact that surprised you most, or with the ethical dilemma you see in how we manage landscapes that both feed us and sustain the pollinators we depend on. The conversation continues there,